I'd like to thank you all for tuning in to my podcast here today that is dedicated to lighthouses and also to the United States Lighthouse Society and what it is that they're doing. Now, that society I did not even realize existed until about 10 years ago. At that time, I was seeing a couple lighthouses off the coast of California. I had gone to Point Arena and I think it's Point Missoula. Hopefully someone isn't offended if I mispronounce that. Those two lighthouses there that are near Fort Bragg, because Fort Bragg is actually one of my favorite places to visit in California. Anyways, while I was there, I went into their gift shop and I came across something that I hadn't really thought of before, and that's where I found the Lighthouse Passport. And of course, I thought that was kind of a weird thing, and so I decided to ask them, the station person there, what's this Lighthouse Passport? What kind of stamps do you put in it? It looks a lot like, an actual passport, like when you're traveling. It's shaped slightly differently, of course. And they said, if you go around to different lighthouses, they will have their own personal stamp that they will put in there when you go and you visit them. And I thought, really, where are all these lighthouses where they have stamps? And of course, they ended up showing me this map that was huge, showing you hundreds of lighthouses that are all over the country. And apparently, they all have their own stamps. And see, this was back in 2010 or 11 that I did this, but I didn't get my first stamp until 2011. And when I was out there doing this, there was probably a lot of wild notions kind of going through my head, because I do have a tendency sometimes to start something and then kind of get deep into it, and then I kind of put it to the side and forget about it, and then I go back to it another time later. And to a certain extent, I was kind of doing that when it came to lighthouses, because though I've always found lighthouses really interesting, I just did not dedicate a lot of time into it, especially when I started my folklore degree, my master's degree in folklore at Utah State University. I had chosen a maritime subject for my thesis there with the folklore program, and it actually turned out to be more along the lines of ghost stories and maritime music, and it was dedicated to the east coast of the United States, or to kind of the east coast of Canada, right in that region, because there were some songs and stories there that I found really interesting. The notion of actually going and researching lighthouses and lighthouse communities, the history of these specific lighthouses, the kinds of things that the people who lived there dealt with, and what they had to encounter on a regular basis in order to preserve those lights to make the sea safe for sailors. That's something that I just did not really find a lot of time for. And I have read quite a few books recently, and now that I have my master's degree, I found that this is actually the area that I'm going to be doing a lot of more research into. I have gone to several lighthouses, almost all of them are on the West Coast in California, and I have gotten these stamps. I have actually gotten 10 of them now, and unfortunately it's like I've gotten 10 over the past 8-9 years, and that's kind of weak. But when you live in Utah, there's really not much coastline, and you only have so much time that you can spend outside of Utah and go up and down the coast. So the last time I went on a stamp hunt, I suppose you could say, apparently Angel Island in San Francisco Bay has 3 stamps that you get there. Then Alcatraz Island has its single stamp. Then there's a lighthouse on either side of the Golden Gate Bridge. They each have their own stamps. And then, of course, there's Point Missoula, Point Arena, and then there's another one called Point Reyes down there, south of Point Arena. And I have to say, of all of them, that one has the most interesting scenery when you look out over the sea. The time that I was there was really fascinating. I just love looking out over the sea when there's fog and you can look out across the ocean with no land in sight, and there's just something about that I really love. All of these things, I started doing this and looking at the stamps, but I didn't really look into the organization that was behind these stamps and passports. I started really looking more into them here in the last year or so. I guess to start with, as far as the Lighthouse Society goes, the United States Lighthouse Society, I thought I'd read you what their mission statement is, and then we can move on from there. So the United States Lighthouse Society is a non-profit historical and educational organization dedicated to saving and sharing the rich maritime legacy of American lighthouses and supporting lighthouse preservation throughout the nation. Besides that, there is also some lighthouses in Canada and around other places that you can get stamps as well. They all acknowledge the desire or need to preserve these lighthouses and to make sure that people understand what they mean to this country. There are no lighthouse keepers living in these lighthouse areas anymore. Almost all of them are automated. I guess I can't say I know for certain that there are 0 lighthouse keepers, because there are always park people who go around and maintain these things. I don't know if anyone actually lives on the premise of a lighthouse anymore, but most of them I know do not. With this particular situation, then, you can go and find all kinds of books that'll tell you lighthouse stories. In other podcasts, in my other broadcasts with my Balladition-ish podcast, I have mentioned a few things about haunted lighthouses. There are a very large number of lighthouses that are purported to be haunted. A lot of people have, when they lived in those lighthouses, they've either seen ghosts or ghosts have been throwing things around the rooms. They making life a living hell for the lighthouse keepers. And it's always interesting to see what these people believed. The beliefs of maritime people a lot of times come with them when they move somewhere, and therefore they might be more susceptible to these ideas. But then other people are saying that, well, some of this stuff they can't possibly have made up, or they couldn't possibly have heard this from someone else because no one had told them the story until this experience happened to them as well. And a lot of the kinds of stories deal with people who had horrific deaths there at the lighthouse, whether murdered by their spouses or whether they committed suicide after a spouse deserted them because they couldn't live with the lighthouse life anymore. Living in a lighthouse was not the most pleasant thing in the world for people to be doing, and anyone knowing about the history there knows that this was not a glamorous life, and some of the people who've had to live in these places, some of those places are worse than others. It's just really demanding of a lot of people. People age before their time. Families grew up there. Most of the time, these stations have nearby towns where people go and get their supplies from, but there are a few places where the nearest land is actually quite a ways away, and so how these people could possibly live there is hard to understand. There are a couple interesting locations that sit on like rocks out in the middle of the ocean type thing, where they went and they built this lighthouse on top of this rock protruding out of the sea, and they felt that they needed this lighthouse in order to keep that area safe, because a lot of them, there's these shallow areas with rocks sticking out of them, and the ships need to know that this is a dangerous place to stay away from. The lighthouse is a very important aspect of that in keeping sailors from going into dangerous waters. One of my favorite lighthouse stories that I might have already mentioned in another podcast, I believe, involved a lighthouse that was actually turned off, but for some reason there's a phantom light that still keeps coming from there and confusing sailors. There are even a couple stories that talk about a sailor who had sailed through a certain area and they noticed this light that wasn't on any of their charts, and they were wondering what the heck's going on. And the Coast Guard says, well, what the heck are you talking about? There's no lighthouse there. But the sailor insists that he saw a light there. And it turns out that there was a light there, like 50 years ago, but it had been demolished and removed a long time ago. So they shouldn't be seeing anything, and yet they keep seeing this ghostly light shining out from this particular spot where the lighthouse was. Then, of course, some abandoned lighthouses, like I said, have purported to be showing their light as well, despite the fact that the Coast Guard has said no more lights being shown here. People have been said to see shadows walking around the parapets at the top of these lighthouses where there weren't supposed to be anybody, and there the light is shining when it's not supposed to be. Or it could just be a lighthouse that is in use still, and it is haunted by a ghost of a keeper who refuses to leave for one reason or another. I think the most famous story that I came across in this regard involved a lighthouse where the lighthouse keeper would go out staring out at sea. He was waiting for a loved one to return from overseas. And in this particular instance, the person that he was waiting for had gone off to Germany. Well, he had gone off to Europe to fight in World War II. And every day, this father would go out and look out over the waters to watch for the ship to return that would have his son on board it, bringing him home. Sort of like the myth about Theseus when he was supposed to return after killing the Minotaur. He was supposed to wave the white flag and let his father know that he had survived, and of course he forgot, and Theseus' father ends up killing himself. But this particular lightkeeper kept looking and watching for his son, and his son ended up dying on the battlefield there somewhere in Europe. And what happened was the father hears about it, and he's so distraught that he kind of goes insane, and the people take him away to the loony bin because they don't think he's capable of continuing his job there. But even though they took him away and he ends up dying in a nearby town, he still is supposed to be going out there and looking to watch for the ship that is supposed to be bringing his son home. And so that is the shadow that everyone keeps seeing, or that is the image that everyone keeps seeing when they look up and they see this ghostly person walking around the parapets of the lighthouse. So the mission of the Lighthouse Society then is something that I think is really a great thing. And of course, I will continue to go and try to get more stamps in my book. Each time you fill your passport, you can hand it in and you get a certain kind of badge indicating how dedicated you are or what your level is within this particular group of people who get stamps in their passports. The main reason I'm bringing this up here right now is I am going to be doing research into people who are involved in this particular aspect of the Lighthouse Society, because I really do want to understand the dedication that people put into this, who they are, where they come from. I'm going to be looking for people who go out and do these stamps, who go out and get them. Are they traveling for the sole purpose of getting stamps? Do they just like going around to all these lighthouses, and if they happen to have the book on them, then they will get it stamped? The person who ran the Angel Island Lighthouse, that ran the Angel Island Park Service there in San Francisco Bay, would talk to me a bit once about the stamps that they had there at Angel Island, and she was really excited about the subject and told me all these different things that are part of the lighthouse organizations, and she was talking about the history of the lighthouses there on Angel Island. People really, really get into this. And other than California, the only other place that I have seen lighthouses is in New York and Buffalo by Lake Erie. And I will have stamps from there. I was able to see some lighthouses from afar, but I could not cross over the Erie Canal in order to get to them. But I'm going to consider myself as having visited them because of my having seen them, and so I will add them to my book. They will be the first non-California stamps to go into my passport, but hopefully there will be many more to come. So I'm going to seek out people within the Coast Guard community, people within the Lighthouse Society community, people who are historians who know about this program. And I want to get a cultural feel of each person, find out if there are common trends, common origins. Are these people of multiple backgrounds? I mean, each state has its own culture of its own. And when people are from maritime communities, some things they take more seriously than others. And so at some point I will be discussing my research into this particular project, but I just wanted to bring that up here now that I have finished my research into the song called The Ghostly Crew, the 12 Ghostly Fishermen, and known of course by a few other names. I'm now going to dedicate a lot of my time to this particular cultural trend of passports at lighthouses. And the first place, of course, that I'm going to search will be with the Lighthouse Society itself to talk to the people who run the place. So wish me luck there, and anytime you are on the coast and you know you're going near a lighthouse, I encourage you to go out and have a look at it and admire the view from the coast, and try and imagine what it's like to be standing out there at night and looking out at sea, seeing this beam of light or this strip of light shining and lighting up the darkness so that you can safely sail through the waters. And until next time then, I'll leave you with that thought, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and hope you listen to my next podcast or my next episode of Balladish-ish, whichever comes first. Have a wonderful day.